Hello and welcome to Diplomatic Corner with Premium Times. My name is Chiamaka Okafor, and today we will be interviewing the UN United Nations Resident Coordinator in Nigeria, Mr. Matthias Schmale, and we're here at the UN House in Abuja to have various conversations around UN's purpose in Nigeria and the several work they do through several agencies under the UN umbrella body. Good morning,
Good
Mr.
morning.
Schmale. Thank you for having us. You have a beautiful office.
Thank you.
It's quite
A big
spacious.
one.
Yeah. I mean, we have a garden setting here, so
Yes, no,
beautiful.
it's a comfortable place.
How long have you been here?
I arrived in early December 2021, so I've been here a little over a year. I'm in my second year.
And what do you like about Nigeria? What were your first impressions about the country?
Nigeria, as you probably know, has quite a bad reputation around the world. So my first positive surprise, and that continues today till today, is that there are many intriguing positive sides to life in Nigeria. I'm thinking of the many young entrepreneurial people I have met every day. I meet colleagues working for the UN, working in the private sector, including working for government, who really have an incredible entrepreneurial, constructive, forward-looking spirit. I also, of course, am taken, like so many others, by Nigeria's rich culture and history. You have great poets and writers. You have great filmmakers. You have great musicians. You know, my sons, when I told them I'm going to Nigeria, they listed a number of musicians I'd never heard about. But it's very clear that for younger people around the world, Nigerian musicians set standards. So there is a lot of positive sides to what goes on in Nigeria, despite, of course, huge challenges.
Before arriving here in 2021, have you visited by chance Nigeria?
I used to work for the International Federation of Red Cross. And so I visited the Nigerian Red Cross, I think it's some 20 years ago, when its headquarters were still in Lagos. So that tells you how long ago this was.
That's quite a long time. So, Nigerian culture, you mentioned the culture, the music, and has any had any lasting impression on you from the culture to the music? Could you give names to this?
Well, I mean, one name that comes to mind is Chimamanda. I heard her speak at last year's UN-sponsored and female ambassador-sponsored International Women's Gala, and she spoke very eloquently. I have had the privilege of hearing Oye Soyinka at one event, you know, challenging, strong. I have had the privilege of hearing some younger poets at various events that where we've been holding with the UN and government jointly. I don't remember their names; they'll be very angry with me. But very impressive young poets who speak very eloquently, very directly about the positives and negatives of their country.
And the musicians?
Musicians, I'm, as I indicated earlier, not so much into the music scene. Of course, I haven't met him, sadly, but Burna Boy is one name that comes to mind.
Okay, interesting. That's good to know. So let's quickly move over to the role UN plays in Nigeria. And that would be to say the UN's office in Nigeria historically now. The UN's office in Nigeria, what role do you play in line with, the founding objective and aim of the larger UN? So what role are you playing in Nigeria? You don't just create an office in a country without a purpose or, a reason for founding it. So what exactly do you do in Nigeria?
So my understanding of the reason the UN historically came to Nigeria is, like in many countries, development. So the government asked us to support their development efforts for the benefit of vulnerable citizens. That's one aspect of it. And a lot of our work, my office as resident coordinator, but primarily the work of the 21 resident UN agencies, is focused on working with government to improve the development prospects for ordinary Nigerian citizens. That's one big part. I think a second part is humanitarian work. So a number of agencies like the World Food Program, for example, the Office for Humanitarian Coordination, came in 2015 when the government asked us to assist in addressing humanitarian needs in the Northeast. So there is humanitarian work focused primarily on the Northeast. And then a third bit is the original mandate of the United Nations is to help create and maintain peace. So we also have a peace component to our work. And that takes the shape primarily so far of helping build local peace coordination and peace building structures in various fields. We've done some work as UN on the farmer-herder conflict. As we are sitting here, there's a regional workshop on this topic going on. And around the current elections and building on past efforts, we're working with the National Peace Committee to get national actors to sign peace accords. They did so in September with us witnessing. And a few days ago, I was in Cross River, where a state level peace accord was signed by the governor candidates, some of them. So that's another aspect of our peace work. So really, the UN's work spans across development work, that's in the center, spans across humanitarian work where government asks us to support. And then we try to remember we are all about peace and human rights, and that needs to also not be forgotten.
But when you talk about peace, human rights, humanitarian support for Nigeria, it quickly reminds me of the concern raised a few days ago by the UN. I think Nderito is her name. I'm not sure I'm
Yes,
pronouncing
Karimo
correctly.
Nderito, yes.
Yeah. And so she raised concerns about the security situation in Nigeria and how it could degenerate if not checked. And over the years, 10 years, if well, more than 10 years actually, Nigeria has had to battle with insurgency. And, I mean, last year, towards the end of last year, there was a security alert by members of diplomatic community, US and UK, warning of an impending terrorist attack here in Nigeria, and that's put a lot of Nigerian citizens and visitors, of course, in a state of pandemonium. And my question to that, in line with your peacekeeping, humanitarian, human rights, we know that insurgency comes with a lot of human right violation, displacing people and all of that. Beyond raising concerns, like you did a few days ago, and saying, oh, there's an impending doom if you're not watching this. What else? What's actions is the
Yeah.
UN taking to see that, there's peace in line with your mandate really in
Yeah.
Nigeria?
So I've referred to one of them, which is working with local actors at state level and sometimes even lower at the LGA level to establish local peace coordination and peace building structures. So as an example, a few months ago, I was in Benue State, and in the presence of the governor, a local peace committee was set up. So the idea behind this is that at the end of the day, challenges concerning human rights and threats to peace are best solved by the people themselves. We cannot solve Nigeria's problems as the UN. We can facilitate, we can convene, having people at the right come together at the table where they need to discuss and agree ways forward. That's one bit. A second bit is communication and media work. And one important aspect of that is to work against hate speech. So you mentioned earlier we were together at an event a week or so ago to commemorate International Holocaust Day. And that for me as resident coordinator was an opportunity to remind all of us and remind Nigeria as a country and its citizens that often genocide and serious violations of peace start with statements that are disrespectful of others, intolerant of others. So we're trying to contribute also through public statements, to media events, through capacity building workshops, to ensuring that people understand violence doesn't often start with violence. It starts with the spoken word and expressions of intolerance and prejudice. So we are working massively for that. A third bit I want to say is there is what we call quiet diplomacy. So you referred to the statement of the Secretary General's Special Advisor on Preventing Genocide. So some of the work is public statements when we see something that's wrong, but a lot of it is behind closed doors. As United Nations, we are here to work and support support government. And shouting from the rooftops will not always help, or will rarely help addressing problems. So a part, and you will not like this, but a part of it is behind closed doors. It's really building relationships, and when we see problems, to take key stakeholders, including senior government representatives, and ask them, can we have a talk on this? Nigeria has signed up to many international conventions. Nigeria believes in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we will commemorate its 75 years of this year. So we because Nigeria is such a proud citizen of the globe and the UN, we have a basis where behind closed doors we can say, you've signed up to, for example, the Human Rights Declaration. Here are examples of where you're violating that. So can we work together on ensuring that you live up to the standards and commitments you've signed up for internationally?
When you talk about violation of human rights, what comes to mind recent past will be the NSAS protest, which was felt globally. We had young people in Nigeria, especially peacefully protesting on the streets against police violence, police brutality, against civilians and all that. And a lot of that protest saw violation of human rights with people who got beaten up, some lost their lives in the process, and we didn't hear a lot of what the UN had to say in line with human rights violation during this protest. So would you please shed more than a little light on what the UN did during this period, and how it is called the Nigerian government to order, and how they are responding to human rights violation? And I'd quickly like to add that it is not peculiar to the End SARS protest, and it doesn't end. Perhaps we have more unreported cases of human rights violation in Nigeria than the reported ones. So what are you doing? Quiet diplomacy, behind the scene, what exactly?
Yeah. So an easy answer related to NSAS specifically would be that it was before my time here. So on a serious note, I don't know all the details. What I've been told by colleagues who were here at the time, and what I've read, is indeed that most of that was quiet diplomacy. So we felt at the time that very public statements could inflame the situation, could block access for us to key people. So indeed, it was mostly quiet diplomacy. But triggered by that, let me mention a current example where there are serious allegations of human rights violations. And that is the recent Reuters reports alleging that the military systematically had a program that led to 10,000 abortions, forced abortions, and other claims and allegations. So that's an example where, in addition to quiet diplomacy, what we're doing is supporting the Nigeria Human Rights Commission investigate this. So our Secretary General immediately publicly said, these are serious allegations that need to be independently from the military, investigated. And so we have ever since been working with the Nigeria Human Rights Commission that, as you will know, 2 days ago also launched the investigation. We are giving them technical support, advice. We are mobilizing our network of expertise and offering up international expertise to ensure this is credible. Now, my understanding is, back to NSARS, that there was an investigation that the Nigeria Human Rights Commission was involved in, and that investigation met international standards. The investigation. I know there are concerns on whether there was then enough follow-up. And that's a third thing that we can do, and we do, is to look at what does accountability mean on behalf of government, military, and others. And what we think plays important roles there is, to give some examples, is civil society. So part of our work is to build relations with civil society to support them. We think that civil society has a key role to play to, on behalf of citizens, with citizens, ask the difficult questions of those in power in terms of, you've signed up to conventions, there's an investigation report, what are you doing about this? So working with and strengthening civil society is another part of this. A further important aspect of addressing human rights issues and ensuring high standards of accountability is strengthening the judiciary. So I have colleagues in the UNODC, the UN's Organization for Drugs and Crimes. They are working against drugs and crimes. They have a lot of legal judiciary expertise, and they're involved in working with judges to strengthen and lawyers to strengthen the judiciary. And an aspect of this is to ensure that citizens have channels in which they can raise complaints and concerns over what's going wrong, including human rights violations. So in a way, what I'm describing there is capacity building of key state actors such as the judiciary and the police. I think and SARS was in part about the police, of course. And so colleagues in UNDP, in UNODC, in fact, work in strengthening the police. And what that means is police, we believe, is an essential part of addressing human rights violations and doing so in a way that is in the interest of citizens. And that requires the police, and this is not unique to Nigeria. We know this, we've seen it recently in the United States. Police forces need to be equipped and trained to fulfill their law enforcing role in a manner that respects the individual rights of the citizens they are there to protect.
Yes. We'll take a short break now, and when we return, we'll talk about UN and the upcoming Nigerian elections. Stay tuned. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we have been speaking to the UN resident coordinator in Nigeria, Mr. Matthias Schmale, and now we're going to move on to talk about UN and the upcoming Nigerian elections to see what you are doing and how you are interfering or not interfering with the process. So, first question is to provide a general overview of what UN is doing um, for the upcoming Nigerian elections.
So there are two main areas of involvement for the UN in Nigeria's elections. The first one is to provide technical support, and that is led by our colleagues in UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, but also by UN Women, for example. So what our colleagues in UNDP are doing is working closely with INEC to support them in better preparation for and administering of the election process. So there's a lot of capacity building, and I think we are seeing results of that, not just because of UN involvement. There are other partners, member states, but in our view is that over years, not just since the last election, but over the last couple of elections, INEC has been making, with our support and other people's support, steady progress. So an element of this is the BIVAS machine, so the better control of verifying voters. There is, in our understanding, significant progress in ensuring that the results cannot be easily manipulated as they're being transmitted centrally. So technical work in ensuring that INEC is in a better place as the organization preparing for and managing elections. Capacity building of INEC officers is another element of this. Now, a second bit of what the UN does is to what we call offering the good offices of the Secretary General. So we have a special representative of the Secretary General who's based in Dakar and who regularly comes, working closely with me as resident coordinator. I represent the Secretary General in country. And what that means is two things. We're trying to build relations. So we're trying to meet all the key candidates and political parties, to impress on them the importance of conducting themselves in a way that will lead to peaceful, credible, inclusive, and transparent elections. So there's a lot of messaging going to the key players involved. Avoid violence, settle your disputes in non-violent ways, avoid hate speech, etc. So it's back to what we touched on earlier: quiet diplomacy, and you can only do quiet diplomacy if you have built relationships with the key actors. Now, in 2019, the good offices of the Secretary General, through his special representative, Mr. Chambers at the time, proved, in my understanding, very valuable when the election was postponed at one day's notice. In my understanding, that really led to significant tensions. Mr. Chambers was on the ground, had access to the key players, including INEC, and was able to contribute to keeping things fairly calm and not letting them get out of control. So we are there, we are preparing to be ready if there's a crisis moment to intervene. Now, if I may say two more things, sort of a mix between technical support and the good offices support is the work our UN women colleagues are doing in particular, but others too, UNFPA as an example, and that is to enhance the role of women in public life. We all know that is a major challenge. Women are subject to a lot of violence and aggressive behavior, and just it is so sad to see when Nigeria has produced so many women of excellence across the world and in the private sector, that in public life Nigeria lags far behind most African countries. So we are also involved as United Nations to ensure that over time women have the chance and opportunity they more than deserve to participate fully. I think those are the key areas of work around elections. You asked in terms of involvement, maybe if I may add one more point. We are under strict instructions, rightfully so, from the Secretary General to remain neutral. So you will never hear me come out in favor of one candidate, of one party. So our focus is really on, let's ensure there is a process that is fair, that is inclusive, that meets international standards, that is transparent. And then we need to trust the Nigerian citizens to produce a result through elections that is good for the country.
Nice. You spoke about the last election postponement. And if you have been following the news or feeling the pulse of Nigerians, you'll see that there's also a fear that the elections may be postponed again. Is there, and I mean, INEC has said the elections won't be postponed, giving assurances to citizens. But is there a conversation on ground between UN, INEC, and of course the government of Nigeria on why there's need to keep the date?
So the hope clearly is that we will stick to the dates. So February 25, of course, for the presidential elections, and March 11 for the state level gubernatorial elections. That's the hope, and we are optimistic. We remain optimistic that that will be possible. We can see one scenario where a postponement would be justified, and that is if preparations are not far enough advanced. So I mentioned earlier the BVAS machines that are needed for verification of registered voters. Of course, they need to be in place at all the polling stations. And we know, because of the fuel crisis, the currency-related crisis, the INEC is having some challenges to ensure that all things are prepared, including having all the material at the polling stations and having their officials at the polling stations. Now, from our point of view, what would be justified is if there is evidence that things are just not ready, and another week or whatever it is needed to do so. So we do talk about, are there scenarios where it's justified? We very much hope that won't be necessary, but we need to entertain it as one scenario. What we are concerned about is elections being postponed due to violence. We hope, and we get regularly assurances, like the country as a whole, from the Inspector General of the Police, military as a complementary to the police force, that they are doing the best they can to ensure that polling stations are protected, that citizens are protected, and that the elections will not be impacted by violence. But I think, like many in the international community, and indeed what I'm hearing from many Nigerians, that's a real fear and worry. Now, again, we hope that this will not become a scenario that it will have to be postponed because of violence.
You've touched on my next question a little, which will be, what are your specific concerns with regards to the upcoming elections? And you touched on currency, fear. So speak to that directly.
Yeah.
What are UN's specific fears or concerns, rather, when it comes to the upcoming elections?
Yeah. So there's a couple. I think violence clearly is one, and it's not just the northeast, it is the southeast and other places in the northwest. So there are countrywide pockets of violence that could negatively affect the running of and the outcome of elections. That remains a concern, and that's why we regularly, with others, talk, for example, to the Inspector General of the Police. I have mentioned some challenges around preparations being far enough advanced in terms of getting materials, the BVAS machines, and so on, and officials to the polling stations. And that is directly linked with the fuel crisis. And also the currency related crisis. Now, you, as much as we, have heard public assurances from the central bank governor, for example, that INEC will have access to the cash they need to make this happen. You've heard assurances from the security forces that they will protect and make sure materials get to the polling stations. But, we have to remain open-minded or we have to continue to work with INEC, support them to make sure from an administrative point elections are ready. A third thing of worry is hate speech. I touched on this earlier. We have heard from all candidates and parties, not always the candidates, sometimes the parties, sometimes the followers of candidates, statements that are not acceptable. And so behind closed doors mostly, we work with all involved to ensure that the language is toned down, that this is conducted, the campaigns are conducted in a respectful and peaceful manner. In this respect, we work very closely with the National Peace Committee. I yesterday met former President General Abdel Salami Abubakar to discuss, compare notes on what's happening. And I must say, I think the National Peace Committee deserves a lot of credit for what they are doing to try and ensure it's free and fair. And then maybe a final point of concern is ensuring there's a level playing field. We've heard some allegations that at times those in power don't provide public institutions for opposition candidates. So that again is an issue that is being addressed through various channels, including the National Peace Committee, to ensure that all sitting governors ensure that all key candidates have the opportunity to present their case to the voters.
Do you have any concerns on the recent overturning of the outcome of the Osun State elections and the Beavers? INEC currently appealed that ruling. But
Yeah.
I want to hear from the UN. What are your concerns? Because Beavers is important for the next elections. And this, of course, will raise doubts on
Yeah.
how credible this technology is.
We are, of course, well aware of that case. In fact, together with some senior diplomats headed by the EU ambassador to Nigeria a week ago or so, we met with the president of the Court of Appeals and some of her eminent judges. Now, we asked them the same question, and they said, which I think is right, that they do not want to publicly comment while it's being looked into what exactly happened. It is concerning that it took 6 months to achieve this ruling. Whether it was right or not, I cannot personally judge. It is worrying that it took so long. And an important point in this respect is that the Court of Appeals president mentioned to us that there are over 600 pre-election appeals. and that there is no way they will be able to adjudicate all that massive volume of appeals before the elections. And then we can expect appeals around the elections themselves. So they are a little bit overburdened. And one worry is that we need to ensure that not that political parties settle some of their internal disputes within their own party constitutions and mechanisms. It's not every time you have something that you feel has gone wrong inside your party or with another party that you run to the court. So we need to protect the court so that it can deal with any appeal in a timely and manner and efficient manner. And Oshun again is an example of where it took too long. Now, the final comment maybe on this is indeed it is extremely important that all the material is in place, including the BIVAS machines, and that the voting, the officials overseeing the election at polling stations know what the rules are. So, as an example, we've been made aware, you will know this, that BIVAS depends on electricity. So what happens if there's no power supply? Now there is clear provisions that an election can be repeated, I think, the following day if there are technical problems. So it is crucial if we want to avoid appeals like the one around Oshun, that really what has been set up works. And that's why I said earlier, the only scenario we can see justifying a postponement is if technically the elections are not ready in all places. It is critical that there is a BIVAS machine at each polling station, that the officials are there, and that the credible and transparent process can happen.
One last question on Nigeria, which is away from the election, before we wrap up this part of the interview that talks about UN and Nigeria, is to ask the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a new strategic framework for 2023 to 2027. And what comes to mind, one question is to say, where is Nigeria in terms of achieving 2030 is what we are working towards? And do you see that Nigeria will get there by 2030?
Sadly, as things stand, Nigeria lags far behind achieving the SDGs on almost all of them. Nigeria is not alone there, but because of Nigeria's size and population-wise, economy-wise, it matters. I've heard many Nigerians tell me if Nigeria sneezes, the rest of the continent gets a cold. And I think that is true for the SDGs. If Nigeria doesn't make significant progress on the SDGs, this will not only show itself in Nigeria, but for the rest of the continent. It's an engine that pulls everyone along. So we are very worried, and we regularly express this to government. Now, by the government's own statistics and data, 130 million people are affected by multidimensional poverty. A report our UNDP and UNICEF colleagues helped pull together, but these are government data, multidimensional poverty. So you can see from that alone that you can just not make the case that Nigeria is making the progress it needs to make on the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So what we've agreed with government is a series of transformative agendas. We need to accelerate the pace. There's some good stories, some good achievements, but the impact and scale needs to be accelerated. And to give one specific example, it is the economy. We are convinced within the UN that Nigeria's challenges around poverty and unemployment will not be solved by international aid increasing. It has to do with increasing domestic resource mobilization. So we will focus very much as a UN system to work with those in power, the next government, of course, the central bank and others, to ensure that really the potential that is there to increase domestic resources will be increased, that there is a critical review of how money is spent. And that, of course, brings in the sensitive topic of fuel subsidies. But what I'm trying to express with this is in a sense, an optimism that Nigeria has the potential and the resources to turn things around. It just needs I think credible, good leadership. It needs a continued strengthening of public institutions. It needs the elections to go well. So I want to be clear that I'm not trying to paint a doomsday scenario. Nigeria has what it takes. It can turn the slow progress around and maybe not achieve all the SDGs by 2030, but make significant visible progress.
What happens when we don't meet up? So, like the MDGs, we had to translate to
Yeah.
SDGs. So, what happens when Nigeria, like a host of other countries, do not meet up with 2030?
I think ultimately the test of all of this is what it means for ordinary citizens. So probably as UN we will complain and say, you're not doing enough. The international community will have things to say. Politicians will have things to say. But I think the measure of it all is how it translates into meaningful progress for a majority of the citizens. And that's what it will boil down to. And it will boil down to whether citizens will have the patience to say, okay, we haven't achieved it yet. I cannot see the fruits of, countrywide labors yet in my life in terms of access for my children to education, as an example, having enough food on the table, and so on. So I really think we need to be very sensitive to citizens, how they see it. And that's why this multidimensional poverty index is important, because it gives us details for the whole country around several dimensions of how citizens are doing. And then hopefully governance is important. We need to ensure, we touched on this earlier, that citizens can vote if they're unhappy and showed accountability that way, and that there are mechanisms where citizens can bring to the attention of those in power where things are going wrong, so that those in power can then correct what they're doing.
Yeah, so we'll move over to the part of the interview where we get to talk about UN within the larger Africa framework. And I'll start by saying that the notion that UN is just a talk shop. You keep talking and talking and no action. And there's been various clamors from Africa, especially to, that time has come for the UN to restructure and be more inclusive. The AU has asked for a seat at the UNSC, and Africa rightfully deserves a place there to make it more inclusive and representative. So when does the UN see it as the right time to restructure its own structure and become more inclusive? Because this is the message you take within your own structures. There seems to be gaps here and there.
So I must say I heard two questions or comments in your question. One is about, are we a talk shop? And I think that's a justified question, because we run many meetings, hold the General Assembly each year. So I'm not surprised that there may be a perception out there that we are a talk shop. Now, having said that, what I think is important to understand is that the value of the UN is primarily in its convening power. We are a global network that can mobilize technical expertise, knowledge, good practice, and share it with different countries. We don't run government services. We are here to support government. And that's why, that's where the challenge is. It's not whether we talk too much, but are we effective in helping governments improve the services for the benefit of citizens? So I think what we should be measured on is this. And I've been challenging my colleagues here in Nigeria. Let's not, having run 5 capacity building workshops will enforce the notion that we are a talk shop. What we need to prove is that building capacity translates into better service delivery for citizens. And that's not just an Africa-wide issue for the UN, that's a global issue. We need to demonstrate that convening people experts together, talking at meetings, translates into meaningful changes in the day-to-day life of citizens. So that's one bit. The other bit is really about power and inclusiveness in the UN. Now, our Secretary General, when he visited last May, at the press conference with Mr. President, acknowledged that there is progress to be made. You know, the Security Council needs to change and have a different, more inclusive setup. And my understanding is that at last year's General Assembly, momentum was gathering, including from some of the powerful Security Council members themselves, to look seriously into getting to a more inclusive structure of the UN's various decision-making bodies.
Interesting. So, in line with those reforms too, and the UNSC, the Security Council, is really important because of the kind of veto power the members wield. And then, question to that will be, how do you is the UN looking to reform the UNSC in a way that it doesn't appropriate so much power to a country? Now, I mean, like we know, a country can veto the decision of other four countries and it leaves it bare there, or other countries rather. And I mean, there's no progress made on that. So how do we make sure that a country does not wield so much power that it stalls progress, development, or whatever adjective you want to use to describe what is going on there?
Allow me to first of all underline that it's important that we're clear on what we mean by the UN. So the UN is, in the first instance, the more than 190 member states. You know, the UN is not me. I'm a civil servant serving member states. And so when we are talking about reforms to the UN, we are talking about member states needing to agree amongst themselves, and we will facilitate that, and we're trying to do our best, needing to agree amongst themselves that things need to change. And that's why I refer to the General Assembly. Our colleagues in New York say for the first time in a long time there was a positive momentum among member states, including the most powerful ones, to initiate serious reforms. Now, you're absolutely right, and as civil servants of the UN, I think we at leadership levels, including myself here in Nigeria, are fully supportive of the notion that veto rights need to be revisited. An inclusive way of governing the UN must be reflected in the form of each member state feeling their voices heard and their vote mattering. I don't know what the concrete answer to that is. I'm not an expert on this, but I can tell you we are very sympathetic to the concern, and I know that my leadership in New York is pushing for revisiting the system of vetoes and taking decisions to make it more inclusive.
Yeah. A quick veer will be to the migration challenge all over the world, but especially Africans who are exiting the continent in small boats. And question is, what action is the UN, through the IOM, of course, taking to make sure that, you know, migrants, people leaving their countries in small boats or through whatever channels, really, and you know, the human right component of their exit or their movement is put into consideration. And I say this to also point out the case in Spain and Italy with turning back migrant with no, you know, regards to human rights issues there. So what is the UN doing around those issues?
So I will give you an answer that reflects what I said earlier about how we work in Nigeria, because this is the way we work to influence human rights agendas, development agendas is not unique to Nigeria. It is about trying to use our convening power, our moral authority to influence states. So just as I was telling you in Nigeria, we try to build relations with those in power and other key stakeholders to try and influence them. The same is happening in Spain, in Italy, and other European countries. So a part of it is that, trying to influence, trying to get governments of the receiving countries of migrants to do their bit in living up to the standards, the
Mm.
global standards they've signed up to. A second bit is indeed service delivery, and you've mentioned IOM, UNHCR. There's a number of the World Health Organization. There's a number of agencies that are trying to accompany migrants,
Mm.
both leaving and sometimes they return,
Absolutely.
including to Nigeria. So it's to work with governments, civil society, and others to address the humanitarian needs that vulnerable migrants have on their journey. So there's the influencing political work, and there is the service delivery work to try and ensure that vulnerable migrants have access to the services that every citizen should have.
Is there any concern around the degree, I hope that's the right expression to use, in terms of migration, Nigeria, Africa, and all over the world?
The degree, you mean the volume?
Yeah, of migrants, people moving around.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are increasing every year. So, of course, we're concerned about this and regularly issue statements. There's a global compact for migrants where we've tried to get member states to agree standards and ways of approaching migration. Some of this is we know that some refugees, some migrants flee because of the desperate situation in their country. And I mean, in particular, wars and conflicts. And so the international discussion is around the ideal is for people to be able to return who want to return. For those who can't, another option has to be to settle where they've arrived. And so we're also working with host countries to ensure that where it's appropriate, migrants can stay and settle. And then a third option that is being looked at globally is a third country option. So you may have arrived in Spain, but there may be better opportunity. You can't go home, but there may be better opportunities in a third state. So we are also working on this. But allow me to add one thing. I want to come back to the development agenda. We sincerely believe, as United Nations civil servants, that a lot of migration that is causing problems elsewhere, not all migration does. I'm a migrant, but I'm not complaining. I have a good job and an interesting one. But the vulnerable migrants and vulnerable migration due to vulnerability, to poverty, to wars and conflicts, refugee issues, need to be addressed through development work. We really internally displaced people in Nigeria. The majority of that, in my understanding, is because of missed development, failing development. So I think the biggest contribution we can make as a globe and as a UN supporting member states is really to accelerate progress in achieving the SDGs. The SDGs are a blueprint for countries ensuring that their citizens have more fulfilled lives and don't need to flee and seek opportunities elsewhere.
Yeah. So going back to the talk shop conversation,
Yeah.
will be the global crisis, the war in Ukraine, and there's been a number of resolutions at the General Assembly, against Russia, to see that the war comes to an end. And a concern is, what have these resolutions translated into? Have they ended at saying, oh, this number of countries voted in favor, this number abstained, and the other number, did not vote or voted for in favor? What have all of these resolutions translated into? What actions are on ground? And quickly to say, at some point last year, Russia was suspended from the Human Rights Council. Where's Russia now?
So some of this is above my pay grade, but let me share the following thoughts. So I think it's a fair question and fair observation that the political efforts within the United Nations system to end the war in Ukraine have not yet shown demonstrable results. That is clear. I cannot claim we are closer to peace in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia than we were 10 months ago because of resolutions and meetings. That's just objectively not the case. Having said that, though, there has been some progress. If our Secretary General were sitting here instead of me, he would rightfully point to the Global Grain Initiative It has been possible in the middle of the war to get the two parties to agree a mechanism where grain gets re-exported and other goods, fertilizers, for the benefit of vulnerable people around the world. So I'm using that because the Secretary General has said this very publicly when he's being asked the same question. The glass is some full. There is some progress in terms of benefits for affected people in the war zone, but also it's impacting the globe, and we are working to try and mitigate the negative impact of this war. But back to your question in terms of resolutions and talk shop, I think with the United Nations, as in the member states of the United Nations, the Security Council remain with a significant challenge to find a way of ending the war. We know from history wars cannot be won, and the price is too big for all citizens involved. So the UN's credibility on the peace side of things will stand and fall with, can a more effective way be found of ending the war rather than just mitigating the impact of it.
And then you didn't respond to the question about Russia's UN
Yeah,
Human
I
Rights
don't know
Council.
the latest on that, whether they are still suspended. And I don't really have a clear opinion and view on whether suspensions from international bodies is a useful step. And the reason I'm saying that is I used to work with the Red Cross before joining the UN. I very much as an individual believe you can only end wars if you talk to people. That's why the Deputy Secretary General recently went to Afghanistan as a woman, given all the challenges there. And I think that was an expression of what I'm trying to say. Excluding people from dialogue, I'm not sure is always an effective tool. Sanctions, exclusion. We all know there have been examples in history. I'm thinking of ending apartheid. I think excluding South Africa at the time and the sanctions regime did contribute massively to ending apartheid. But there is no one solution fits all. And so your specific question, I don't know enough to be able to judge whether that's an effective measure or not.
So the point you made about talking, mediation seems to be significantly absent in the Russia-Ukraine war. Two questions here. Is the UN averse to mediation? And if you're not, why are we not seeing mediation happening? Because like you said, that's really what significantly will bring us close to an end or to an end of the war.
So the UN is not at all averse to mediation and talking. In fact, the Secretary General was meant to come to Nigeria a bit earlier last year than the end of May. He postponed the trip because he offered mediation services to Russia and Ukraine, and they took him up on it. So his priority at the time was, let me first go there and start the negotiations, and then he came to Nigeria. So he didn't cancel Nigeria, he just postponed it. And to the best of my knowledge, the Secretary General and other senior UN leaders are continuing in quiet diplomacy behind closed doors to try and get the two parties to talk about how to end the war. I am not privy to exactly what progress is being made on those talks. It's not public. Some of our efforts to get people to talk are behind closed doors. And that makes it sometimes frustrating, I think, for media, because I cannot tell you exactly what's going on, because we firmly believe if we start talking publicly about confidential processes, it will undermine them. That's not to say that there will come a time where you deserve more clear answers to the questions.
So quiet diplomacy. Interesting. So the last but not the least question, I'm sure you really want to run away from this state. The war in Ukraine will be 1 year by February 24th. What actions is the US taking to see that we don't have a repetition of what is happening in Ukraine elsewhere? Take, for example, China, Taiwan, Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan, pockets of this here and there. So what is the UN doing as a convening power, to see that member states do not resort to crisis or war?
So there is, you will not be surprised if I tell you, a part of that is the quiet diplomacy bit, but a part of it is very public. I don't know if you've had a chance to see the Secretary General's statement to the General Assembly, I think it was a week or two ago, outlining his priorities for this year.
Yeah.
And he spoke very eloquently and powerfully, I think, about the risk of the world sleepwalking into further disasters
Yeah.
like the Ukraine. And so, the Secretary General, as our chief executive officer, chief administrative officer, is using his power, his moral authority, to regularly remind member states that we must at all costs avoid the kind of crisis we're seeing in Ukraine, because it's not just destructive and detrimental for the citizens of those two countries, but for the globe. And we cannot afford, with all the other challenges we have around climate change and so on, further wars like that. And again, so there is both private and public diplomacy, and trying to use the convening power of the UN to get member states together to resolve crises, to prevent crises from escalating before it's too late.
In your opening statement at the beginning of this interview, you talked about how much of a bad reputation Nigeria has. Having lived here for a year plus, what's your own impression of Nigeria? And I'm asking this question because, like you, many other people there, have truths about the reality of Nigeria across the globe and also Africa as well. So, the bad reputation you had before coming here, does it persist up to now?
No, it's been modified, if I'm honest. And allow me to use an expression I've used in this interview that I heard from our Deputy Secretary General. What I've really understood and am firmly convinced of is the glass is some full. Maybe it's not half full, maybe it's three quarters full. I don't know, how do you measure that? But it is not it's not a failed state. And I have seen enough over this year, and not just in Abuja. I think I've traveled to at least 15 states by now. I've seen enough people, it's all about people at the end of the day, who have an entrepreneurial, a peace building mindset. A mindset that is about improving their lives, to remain hopeful and optimistic, that the at times desperate circumstances, we spoke about the 130 million people living in multidimensional poverty according to government. So it's not a rosy picture. I'm not trying to say that either. What I'm trying to say is that despite the challenges, the massive challenges, which are part of why it has such a bad reputation, there is enough in this country to turn this around. And I see it as my job as a senior UN official to not be a prophet of gloom, but to say, let's build on what's working and try and expand and accelerate that.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Schmale.
Thank you.
We've come to the end of this interview, and we have been speaking to the UN Resident Coordinator in Nigeria, Mr. Matthias Schmale, here at the UN office. And this is Premium Time Diplomatic Corner, where we have diplomats on their seats or in our seats answering the hard and easy questions about the work they do with Nigeria. Do not forget to follow us on our various social media handles: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter at Premium Times NG. Thank you.